I'm not certain, I said, unable to keep my eyes off that awful medieval Satan. I would have to know from whom it comes, whether it came from other vampires or elsewhere. Elsewhere? He said. What is elsewhere? That, I pointed to the medieval picture. That is a picture, he said. Nothing more? Nothing more. Then Satan, some satanic power, doesn't give you your power here, either as leader or as vampire. No, he said calmly. So calmly it was impossible for me to know what he thought of my questions, if he thought of them at all in the manner which I knew to be thinking. And the other vampires? No, he said. Then we are not, I sat forward, the children of Satan. How could we be the children of Satan? He asked. Do you believe that Satan made this world around you? No, I believe that God made it, if anyone made it. But he also must have made Satan, and I want to know if we are his children. Exactly. And consequentially, if you believe God made Satan, you must realize that all Satan's power comes from God, and that Satan is simply God's child, and that we are God's children also. There are no children of Satan, really. I couldn't disguise my feelings at this. I sat back against the leather, looking at that small woodcut of the devil, released for the moment from any sense of obligation of Armand's presence, lost in my thoughts, in the undeniable implications of his simple logic. But why does this concern you? Surely what I say doesn't surprise you, he said. Why do you let it affect you? Let me explain, I began. I know that you're a master vampire. I respect you, but I'm incapable of your detachment. I know what it is, and I do not possess it, and I doubt that I ever will. I accept this. I understand, he nodded. I saw you in the theater, your suffering, your sympathy with that girl. I saw your sympathy for Dennis when I offered him to you. You die when you kill, as if you feel that you deserve to die, and you stint on nothing. But why, with this passion and this sense of justice, do you wish to call yourself the child of Satan? I'm evil. Evil as any vampire who ever lived. I've killed over and over and will do it again. I took that boy Dennis when you gave him to me, though I was incapable of knowing whether he would survive or not. Why does that make you as evil as any vampire? Aren't there gradations of evil? Is evil a great perilous gulf into which one falls with the first sin, plummeting to the depth? Yes, I think it is, I said to him. It's not logical, as you would make it sound, but it's that dark, that's empty, and it is without consolation. But you're not being fair, he said, with the first glimmer of expression in his voice. Surely you attribute great degrees and variations to goodness. There is the goodness of the child, which is innocence, and then there is the goodness of the monk who has given up everything to others and lives a life of self-deprivation and services. The goodness of saints, the goodness of good housewives. Are all these the same? No, but equally and infinitely different from evil, I answered. I didn't know I thought such things. I spoke them now as my thoughts, and they were my most profound feelings, taking a shape they could never have taken had I not spoken them, had I not thought them out this way in conversation with another. I thought myself then possessed of a passive mind, in a sense. I mean that my mind could only pull itself together, formulate thought out of the muddle of longing and pain when it was touched by another mind, fertilized by it, deeply excited by that other mind and driven to form conclusions. I felt now the rarest, most acute alleviation of loneliness. I could easily visualize and suffer that moment years before in another century, when I had stood at the foot of Babette's stairway and feel the perpetual metallic frustration of years with Lestat, and then that passionate and doomed affection for Claudia, which had made loneliness retreat behind the soft indulgence of the senses, the same senses that longed for the kill. And I saw the desolate mountaintop in Eastern Europe where I had confronted that mindless vampire and killed him in the monastery ruins. And it was if the great feminine longing of my mind were being wakened again to be satisfied. And this I felt despite my own words. But it's that dark, that empty, and it is without consolation. I looked at Armand, at his large brown eyes in the taut, timeless face, watching me again like a painting, and I felt the slow shifting of the physical world I'd felt in the painted ballroom, the pull of my old delirium, the wakening of a need so terrible that the very promise of its fulfillment contained the unbearable possibility of disappointment. And yet there was the question, the awful, ancient, hounding question of evil. I think I put my hands to my head as mortals do when so deeply troubled that they instinctively cover the face, reach for the brain as if they could reach through the skull and massage the living organ out of its agony. "And how is this evil achieved?" he asked. "How does one fall from grace and become in one instant as evil as the mob tribunal of the Revolution, or the most cruel of the Roman emperors? Does one merely have to miss Mass on Sunday? Or bite down on the communion host? Or steal a loaf of bread? Or sleep with a neighbor's wife?" "No," I shook my head. "No. But if evil is without gradation, and it does exist, this state of evil, then only one sin is needed. Isn't that what you are saying? That God exists and—" "I don't know if God exists," I said. "And for all I do know, he doesn't exist." "Then no sin matters," he said. "No sin achieves evil." "That's not true, because if God doesn't exist, we are the creatures of highest consciousness in the universe. We alone understand the passage of time and the value of every minute of human life, and what constitutes evil, real evil, is the taking of a single human life. Whether a man would have died tomorrow or the day after or eventually, it doesn't matter, because if God does not exist, this life, every second of it, is all we have." He sat back, as if for the moment stopped, his large eyes narrowing, then fixing on the depths of the fire. This was the first time since he had come for me that he had looked away from me, and I found myself looking at him unwatched. For a long time he sat in this manner, and I could all but feel his thoughts, as if they were palpable in the air like smoke. Not read them, you understand, but feel the power of them. It seemed he possessed an aura, and even though his face was very young, which I knew meant nothing, he appeared infinitely old, wise. I could not define it because I could not explain how the youthful lines of his face, how his eyes expressed innocence and this age and experience at the same time. He rose now and looked at Claudia, his hands loosely clasped behind his back. Her silence all this time had been understandable to me. These were not her questions. Yet she was fascinated with him, and was waiting for him, and no doubt learning from him all the while that he spoke to me. But I understood something else now as they looked at each other. He had moved to his feet with a body totally at his command, devoid of the habit of human gesture rooted in necessity, ritual, fluctuation of mind, and his stillness now was unearthly, and she, as I'd never seen before, possessed the same stillness. And they were gazing at each other with a preternatural understanding from which I was simply excluded. I was something whirling and vibrating to them, as mortals were to me, and I knew when he turned towards me again that he'd come to understand she did not believe or share my concept of evil. His speech commenced without the slightest warning. "This is the only real evil left," he said to the flames. "Yes," I answered, feeling that all-consuming subject alive again, obliterating all concerns as it always had for me. "It's true," he said, shocking me, deepening my sadness, my despair. "Then God does not exist. You have no knowledge of his existence." "None," he said. "No knowledge." I said it again, unafraid of my simplicity, my miserable human pain. "None. And no vampire here has discourse with God or with the devil." "No vampire that I've ever known," he said, musing, the fire dancing in his eyes. "And as far as I know today, after 400 years, I am the oldest living vampire in the world." I stared at him, astonished. Then it began to sink in. It was as I'd always feared, and it was as lonely. It was as totally without hope. Things would go on as they had before, on and on. My search was over. I sat back listlessly watching those licking flames. It was futile to leave him to continue it, futile to travel the world only to hear again the same story. 400 years. I think I repeated the words. 400 years. I remember staring at the fire. There was a log falling very slowly in the fire, drifting downwards in a process that would take it in the night. And it was pitted with tiny holes where some substance that had larded it through and through had burned away fast. And in each of these tiny holes there danced a flame amid the larger flames. And all of these tiny flames with their black mouths seemed to me faces that made a chorus. And the chorus sang without singing. The chorus had no need of singing. In one breath in the fire, which was continuous, it made its soundless song. And all at once, Armand moved in a loud rustling of garments, a descent of crackling shadow and light that left him kneeling at my feet, his hands outstretched holding my head, his eyes burning. "This evil, this concept, it comes from disappointment, from bitterness. Don't you see? Children of Satan, children of God, is this the only question you bring to me? Is this the only power that obsesses you? So that you must make us gods and devils yourself, when the only power that exists is inside ourselves? How could you believe in these old fantastical lies, these myths, these emblems of the supernatural?" He snatched the devil from above Claudia's still countenance so swiftly that I couldn't see the gesture, only the demon leering before me and then crackling in the flames. Something was broken inside me when he said this. Something ripped aside so that a torrent of feeling became one with my muscles in every limb. I was on my feet now, backing away from him. "Are you mad?" I asked, astonished at my own anger, my own despair. "We stand here, the two of us, immortal, ageless, rising nightly to feed that immortality on human blood. And there at your desk, against that knowledge of the ages, sits a flawless child as demonic as ourselves. And you ask me how I could believe I would find a meaning in the supernatural. I tell you, after seeing what I have become, I could damn well believe anything. Couldn't you? And being thus confounded, I can now accept the most fantastical truth of all, that there is no meaning to any of this." I backed towards the door, away from his astonished face, his hand hovering before his lips, the lips curling to dig into his palm. "Don't come back," he whispered. "No, not now. Let me go, just a while. Let me go. Nothing's changed. It's all the same. Let that sink into me. Just let me go." I looked back before I shut the door. Claudia's face was turned towards me, though she sat as before, her hands clasped on her knee. She made a gesture then, subtle as her smile, which was tinged with the faintest sadness that I was to go on. It was my desire to escape the theatre then entirely, to find the streets of Paris and wander, letting the vast accumulation of shocks gradually wear away. But as I groped along the stone passage of the lower cellar, I became confused. I was perhaps incapable of exerting my own will. It seemed more than ever absurd to me that Lestat should have died, if in fact he had, and looking back on him, as it seemed I was always doing, I saw him more kindly than before. Lost like the rest of us, not the jealous protector of any knowledge he was afraid to share. He knew nothing. There was nothing to know. Only that was not quite the thought that was gradually becoming clear to me. I had hated him for all the wrong reasons. Yes, that was true. But I did not fully understand it yet. Confounded, I found myself sitting on those dark steps, the light from the ballroom throwing my own shadow on the rough floor, my hands holding my head, a weariness overcoming me. My mind said sleep, but more profoundly, my mind said dream. And yet I made no move to return to the Hotel St. Gabriel, which seemed a very secure and airy place to me now, a place of subtle and luxurious mortal consolation, where I might lie in a chair of puce velvet, put one foot on an ottoman, and watch the fire lick the marble tile, looking for all the world to myself in the long mirrors like a thoughtful human. Flee to that, I thought. Flee all that is pulling you. And again came that thought. I have wronged Lestat. I have hated him for all the wrong reasons. I whispered it now, trying to withdraw it from the dark, inarticulate pool of my mind. And the whispering made a scratching sound in the stone vault of the stairs. But then a voice came softly to me on the air, too faint for mortals. How is this so? How did you wrong him? I turned round so sharp that my breath left me. A vampire sat near me, so near as to almost brush my shoulder with the tip of his boot, his legs drawn up close to him, his hands clasped around them. For a moment I thought my eyes deceived me. It was the trickster vampire whom Armand had called Santiago. Yet nothing in this manner indicated his former self, that devilish, hateful self that I had seen, even only a few hours ago when he had reached out for me and Armand had struck him. He was staring at me over his drawn-up knees, his hair disheveled, his mouth slack and without cunning. It makes no difference to anyone else, I said to him, the fear in me subsiding. But you said a name. I heard you say a name, he said. A name I don't want to say again, I answered, looking away from him. I could see now how he'd fooled me, why his shadow had not fallen over mine. He crouched in my shadow. The vision of him slithering down those stone stairs to sit behind me was slightly disturbing. Everything about him was disturbing. And I reminded myself that he could in no way be trusted. It seemed to me that Armand, with his hypnotic power, aimed in some way for the maximum truth in presentation of himself. He had drawn out of me without words my state of mind. But this vampire was a liar, and I could feel his power, a crude, pounding power that was almost as strong as Armand's. You come to Paris in search of us, and then you sit alone on the stairs, he said in a conciliatory tone. Why don't you come up with us? Why don't you speak to us and talk to us of this person whose name you spoke? I know who it was. I know the name. You don't know, couldn't know. It was a mortal, I said now, more from instinct than conviction. The thought of Lestat disturbed me, the thought that this creature should know of Lestat's death. You came here to ponder mortals. Justice done to mortals, he asked, but there was no reproach or mockery in his tone. I came to be alone. Let me not offend you. It's a fact, I murmured. But alone in this frame of mind. when you don't even hear my steps? I like you. I want you to come upstairs." And as he said this, he slowly pulled me to my feet beside him. At that moment, the door of Armand's cell threw a long light into the passage. I heard him coming, and Santiago let me go. I was standing there, baffled. Armand appeared at the foot of the steps with Claudia in his arms. She had that same dull expression on her face which she'd had all during my talk with Armand. It was as if she were deep in her own considerations, and saw nothing around her, and I remember noting this, though not knowing what to think of it, that it persisted even now. I took her quickly from Armand, and felt her soft limbs against me, as if we were both in the coffin, yielding to that paralytic sleep. And then, with a powerful thrust of his arm, Armand pushed Santiago away. It seemed he fell backwards, but is up again only to have Armand pull him towards the head of the steps. But was up again only to have Armand pull him up towards the head of the steps. All of this happening so swiftly, I could only see the blur of their garments and hear the scratching of their boots. Then Armand stood alone at the head of the steps, and I went upwards towards him. "You cannot safely leave the theatre tonight," he whispered to me. "He is suspicious of you, and my having brought you here. He feels that it is his right to know you better. Our security depends on it." He guided me slowly into the ballroom, but then he turned to me and pressed his lips almost to my ear. "I must warn you. Answer no questions. Ask and you open one bud of truth for yourself after another, but give nothing. Nothing. Especially concerning your origin." He moved away from us now, beckoning for us to follow him into the gloom where the others were gathered, clustered like remote marble statues, their faces and hands all too like our own. I had the strong sense then of how we were all made from the same material, a thought which had never only occurred to me occasionally in all the long years in New Orleans, and it disturbed me, particularly when I saw one or more of the others reflected in the long mirrors that broke the density of those awful murals. Claudia seemed to awaken, as I found one of the carved oak chairs and settled into it. She leaned towards me and said something strangely incoherent, which seemed to mean that I must do as Armand said, say nothing of our origin. I wanted to talk with her now, but I could see that tall vampire, Santiago, watching us, his eyes moving slowly from us to Armand. Several women vampires had gathered around Armand, and I felt a tumult of feeling as I saw them put their arms around his waist. And what appalled me as I watched was not their exquisite form, their delicate features and graceful hands made hard as glass by vampire nature, or their bewitching eyes which fixed on me now in a sudden silence. What appalled me was my own fierce jealousy. I was afraid when I saw them so close to him, afraid when he turned and kissed them each, and as he brought them near to me, I was unsure and confused. Estelle and Celeste are the names I remember, porcelain beauties, who fondled Claudia with the license of a blind, running their hands over her radiant hair, touching even her lips, while she, her eyes still misty and distant, tolerated it all, knowing that I also knew, and what they seemed unable to grasp, that a woman's mind as sharp and distinct as their own lived within that small body. It made me wonder as I watched her turning about for them, holding out her lavender skirts and smiling coldly at their adoration, how many times I must have forgotten, spoken to her as if she were the child, fondled her too freely, brought her into my arms with an adult's abandon. My mind went in 3 directions. That last night in the Hotel St. Gabriel, which seemed a year ago, when she talked of love with rancor, my reverberating shock at Armand's revelations, or lack of them, and a quiet absorption of the vampires around me, who whispered in the dark beneath the grotesque murals. for I could learn much from the vampires without ever asking a question, and vampire life in Paris was all that I'd feared it to be, and all the little stage in the theatre above had indicated it was. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. Alright, that is another 10 pages of Interview with the Vampire, and what an amazing little section that was. It feels like now that we're in this part of the novel, we're just getting banger after banger in regards to really, really interesting themes and character interactions. So let's talk about the cool stuff that happened today. The bulk of this section is taken up by this philosophical conflict between Louis and Armand. Sparked, of course, by the little bit at the end of yesterday's section where Louis asks, what gives Armand his authority, and Armand remarks that what would he respect in regards to that authority, and does he believe authority comes from a higher power? That's the gist of it. And throughout the conversation that ensues, something amazing happens. And it's that Louis finally figures something out. He finally realizes something. All of those times that I've observed that Louis has seen his own actions reflected back on him in other characters and viewed them unfavorably, they finally clicked with him. And it's finally happened in just the right way and just the right number of times for him to realize that he's wrong, or that he at least had a wrong view of things. I remarked on the similarity of Armand's moral structure to his own, even going so far as Louis to remark on the detachment that Armand shows, and we all remember that detachment term from earlier. And looking at Armand acting in the way he does and viewing the world as he does, Louis has realized how absurd it is. And he even admits to himself that the main reason he realizes how absurd it is that he is discussing it and seeing it reflect back on himself, and seeing him learn that, or seeing Armand reveal the way he views the world. And Louis just goes, no, that's insane, even though that was how he was roughly viewing the world before this. So what is it, essentially? Well, Armand reveals to Louis that there is no god or devil that he knows of, and that at 400 years old, he is the oldest living vampire. One of the things I really hate about the sequels is that it reveals that Armand is not only incorrect here. I'm okay with Armand being incorrect here about him being the oldest living vampire. That's fine. But in Queen of the Damned, there's this throwaway line where Armand goes, oh yeah, that time I told Louis I was the oldest living vampire, I was lying. Just because. He doesn't really have a good reason to lie to Louis about being the oldest living vampire as far as he knows. He just apparently does it. Maybe to prove his point, I guess. I think that's pretty dumb, and I don't really count it, and it's one of the reasons I read Interview as an independent text, and I consider the sequels as interesting things that are very different stories. So let's just agree with Armand and take his narrative that he is the oldest living vampire as far as he knows. And what this implies very heavily is that vampires usually get quite depressed and kill themselves after a certain amount of time. Because obviously something made him a vampire, someone made him a vampire. We meet that character, but not in this book. And that under his system, where he is apparently the oldest living vampire, that individual who made him would probably get depressed and go greet a sunrise, essentially. And the thing this is meant to tell to Louis, I suppose, is it's meant to show him the meaninglessness of existence. It's meant to show Louis that there's no god or the devil because he's the oldest living vampire at 400 years old, and that There's just nothing else beyond that. But it has a subtext which I think is potentially unintentional from Armand's perspective, because it reveals how flawed his view of the world is. It reveals how flawed the vampiric moral structure that he's promoting, and presumably many vampires before him have promoted, actually is. Because it seems that all of these vampires that came before him have killed themselves from utter depression at existence. They've looked at the meaninglessness of existence, and the moral outlook they possess of the world has driven them mad. Which implies that the way they're looking at the world is not very effective or very good at the end of the day. And the foundation of this belief, the moral outlook they're going for here, it basically boils down to the notion of nothing means anything. So evil doesn't exist. So it's okay for us to act. And the way Armand manifests this notion is through being this kind of conscious death. And it's okay for us to do what we do because we are manifest death and evil doesn't exist, etc., etc., which is very similar to the argument Louis kind of formulates that we've discussed previously. And when Armand presents this view to Louis, he realizes that it's absurd. He can't distinctly define what exactly about it is absurd. And I've talked about its absurdity multiple times. We won't go too into detail on that here. But it's clear to him that there is something wrong with how Armand is presenting meaninglessness and evil, and subsequently how he has been presenting meaninglessness and evil. Armand presenting this view that, well, if you think evil exists, what's the cutoff point? When does an action become progressively evil? Why aren't there tiers of evil? It doesn't exist. It can't exist. It's dumb. And Louis just responds with this notion of that's not true. I don't understand, but there is a distinction between good and evil. There has to be something there, because the alternative is utter meaninglessness. And even if everything is meaninglessness, that you then have to kind of formulate your own meaning within that. And he gets really close to this, and he's kind of like treading in this area when he points out that even if there is no God, all that concludes then is that mankind is even more important than it had previously considered itself. Human life is infinitely more important if there is no God, because it's all there is. It is meaning out of meaninglessness. And he puts it forward to Armand, and it's very telling that this view of the world where Louis is constructing, and he's getting really, really close to realizing that it doesn't matter that nothing means anything, because you're allowed to plant your own meaning onto things, and you're allowed to be kind, and you're allowed to experience joy from helping people. It infuriates Armand. It's incredibly fitting that this view of the world infuriates Armand, but it also fascinates Armand, because Armand kind of realizes, I think, that he is not able to sustain himself with his current view of the world. He's kind of forced to confront the fact that the way he's viewing the world, this hyper-nihilist, egoist view of the world, is killing him slowly. It is depressing him. It's giving him, the term they use later is the stamina for ages, or whatever it is. It's making it impossible for him to live this long period of time he has been allotted, because he just can't deal with how depressing it is. And he realizes that, and he's infuriated at what Louis is saying, but he also realizes that he has a point. And he tells Louis to leave and not come back, but, he doesn't let Louis leave at the end of the day. And his fascination with Louis is going to lead to a lot of the interesting things coming up in the book. And we'll see how well that Louis actually, sticks to this revelation he's had. Louis had this really good revelation that even if God doesn't exist and even if nothing means anything, that just means it's even more important for us to make our own meaning in the world and try to be as good as possible to other people. even though he's gotten close to that, we'll see how well he sticks with it. We'll see how well the things that happen allow him to formulate this view and potentially get closer to a more, a more completed version of it. And I can't remember exactly how well he does some of the things over the next 30, 50 pages. So we'll get to discover that together, but rediscover that together, I suppose. But it's interesting, and if anything, it is at least an indication that he has learned something, in that he appears to finally be realizing that this notion of detachment and this crippling nihilism is really dumb, and he's escaping it, and that's good. Relatively, because he's still a pretty bad person, but it's a step. It's a step. Claudia, on the other hand, Claudia does not share these moral concerns at all. She stays behind in the office after him. And it makes sense that Claudia isn't worried about these moral concerns, because she was never given the opportunity to develop morality. She was never given the opportunity to develop a moral system herself, so why would she be too worried about it? She doesn't really understand it, and I don't think she'd ever be able to understand it in the same way that someone who lived a mortal life properly would be able to. She could probably learn some of the tenets of it, but she'd never intrinsically understand it. Kind of in the same way that, even if you learn a second language, you'll never understand it as intrinsically as someone who grew up knowing it. I think is the best way to describe that. Her concern is far more with the vampiric condition, and we'll see how that concern develops and how she seeks to maintain her security and survival in light of the plot developments that arrive. So, final little point I have noted down here relates to the female vampires of the Coven. And one of the things that I find a bit weird here is that for some reason the female vampires of the Coven at the theatre are sexually submissive to Armand, whilst Santiago and the other male vampires appear to be purely just less powerful than him and subservient to him. Perhaps there'll be a scene coming up that changes that. I can't remember exactly. But it appears weird, and so far what I'm thinking this kind of represents is it's indicative of the vampiric perception of women, where even as full vampires they take a subservient role, but that subservience is tinged particularly by sexual subservience, in distinct as would be indicated by the kind of patriarchal structure of vampire society that I've commented on. And we'll see how that develops. That's just a thought I've had that's kind of noted down here haphazardly. I can't remember how this exactly develops, so it will be interesting to see, and I will happily go back on that comment if evidence arises in the text to contradict it. Regardless, that is another little section of Interview with the Vampire. Absolutely adored that section. I forgot how good that conversation between Louis and Armand was. So I'll see you again tomorrow for some more, and hope you enjoy it. See you then.